Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. Welcome to the next episode. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the launch of the Famicom in Japan. The Famicom launched with 3 games: Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye, all ports of arcade games. A few months later, Mario Bros. Also saw a Famicom port, and since there wasn't really a good place to put the summary for that game, I'm going to include it in this video, along with the other 3 launch games. If you're wondering why I'm doing all 4 of these games at once, instead of doing them each individually, it is because they're all ports of games I have already talked about in detail. Instead of repeating myself from the previous videos, I will mostly be talking about the major changes from their arcade counterparts and give a quick overview of my brief time with them. Before we do that though, let's look at the launch of the Famicom in Japan, the console that would shake up the entire video game industry and change gaming forever. For those of you that don't already know, the Famicom was the original Japanese version of the Nintendo Entertainment System. The name wasn't the only difference between the Famicom and the NES, as the 2 consoles had completely different visual designs, in addition to having a different pinout configuration that resulted in a few minor changes to the system. I will mostly be talking about the Famicom today, and I'll talk more about the NES launch in a future video. The Famicom actually launched a bit over 2 years prior to the NES, so a lot of these earlier games came out in Japan quite a bit before their Western release. Although I am playing the US versions of these games, I am playing them in the order of whenever they first released, which is usually the Japanese release date. As a result, you may find that the order of these games is not quite how you remember them. For example, these arcade ports were not actually launch titles when the NES was released in the West. I was considering using the Western release dates when I first started this challenge, but I figured using the Japanese dates more accurately represented the actual timeline of when Nintendo developed and published these games. Up until this point, we have mostly discussed games developed by Nintendo's primary development team during the arcade era, Nintendo R&D 1. However, Nintendo had another development team during this time that mostly focused on developing new hardware, Nintendo R&D 2. They were the ones responsible for the Color TV game systems we looked at early on in the challenge. The Color TV games were part of the very first generation of video game consoles, and while we don't often hear about Nintendo's involvement during this era, Nintendo had higher console sales than any of their competitors during that time. For whatever reason though, Nintendo was largely absent as a console manufacturer during the second generation, with the only consoles that Nintendo manufactured during this era being the Game & Watch games. The second generation of video games was marked by the introduction of video game cartridges, which customers could buy separately from the consoles. A lot of the success of home consoles during this time was fueled in part by the golden era of arcade games. Nintendo saw this growing success of video game consoles, and in late 1981, Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, tasked Nintendo R&D 2 to make a console that could let people play arcade games at home. The head of this team was Masayuki Uemura, an engineer that had been working with Nintendo ever since they had been developing light gun technology for the laser clay shooting system. Yamauchi tasked Uemura with the difficult job of making a system that was both cheaper and more powerful than its competitors. Initially, Uemura meticulously took apart and analyzed the consoles made by the competition. He even had the plastics on the competitors' chips melted down so he could analyze the circuitry up close to help him understand it. Unfortunately, he found that their designs were old-fashioned and unusable, and he decided not to use anything based on their designs in his console. Instead, his team turned to arcade machines themselves as inspiration, and ended up basing the hardware designs on the internals of actual arcade machines like their very own Donkey Kong. Their initial proposal was to make an advanced 16-bit system as a full-fledged computer that would include a keyboard and a floppy disk drive. However, Yamauchi rejected this idea, as he believed making a simpler device would both be cheaper and less intimidating to people who weren't familiar with technology. So, instead they decided to make the system an 8-bit device that would read from cartridges instead of floppy disks. They also ended up ditching the idea of packaging it with a keyboard, and decided to just use controllers that were based on some of the designs that could be found on their Game & Watch systems. Thus, the Famicom was born. The actual name itself came from Uemura's wife, who suggested the name as a variation of the word pasokun, which came from personal computer. She argued that the Famicom wasn't just for personal use, so they should call it the family computer. The system launched in Japan on July 15th of 1983, which, as you might already know, was around the same time as the big video game crash of 1983. Now, you might have expected this to have an impact on the Japanese launch of the system, but Japan was actually largely unaffected by the crash of 1983. I'll go into a bit more detail about this once we get to the launch of the NES in the West. That being said, the Famicom did have a bit of a slow start in Japan, largely due to a bad chip that was causing the system to constantly crash. After recalling the system and upgrading the motherboard though, its popularity skyrocketed, and it was already the best-selling console of all time in Japan by the end of 1984. Its explosive success ushered in the third generation of video games and the eventual revival of video games worldwide. Now, as I said before, the actual launch titles of the console were simply just ports of some of their biggest arcade games. These ports were largely handled by Nintendo R&D 2 themselves, serving as the first standalone video games developed by their team. While the arcade releases of these games were obviously a massive part of Nintendo's early success, some modern audiences might be more familiar with the NES versions of these games, as these were the only versions that were ported to the Virtual Console in future years. Alright, let's take a look at these actual games. We've got 4 games to get through, so strap yourselves in. While most of these were all released on the same day, I played them in order of their arcade releases. This means that first up is Donkey Kong. Before going into my run of the game, let's take a look at what was different between this version and the arcade version. The most obvious change in this version is that they completely removed the pie level from the game. This was apparently due to the cartridges not having enough memory. Considering just how much more advanced games would get on the NES, I wouldn't be surprised if this was largely due to them not knowing how to optimize their games for the new hardware. For similar reasons, most of the cutscenes were removed in this version too. The other big change was that they added more game modes. They had 2 different difficulty options now, and each of these difficulties could be played in a 2-player mode now in addition to the normal single-player mode. It's also worth noting that the easy mode in particular felt much easier than the arcade version of the game. It seems like the amount of barrels thrown at you was majorly toned down. There are some minor changes too, such as the first hammer being in a different location, the game in general being more squished to fit the screen resolution of TVs at the time, and the title screen has an all-new song. There are also probably other minor changes all over the place, as I'm pretty sure Nintendo R&D 2 rewrote the entire game from scratch. Another thing that's going to be true for all of these arcade games was that I could no longer configure the lives like I could with the arcade machines. Generally speaking, the amount of lives they start you with in these versions was only 3 lives, which was notably less than what I was used to. While I don't always plan on playing every game on every difficulty, this game was short enough that I decided to beat a loop in both game modes A and B, and I started with game mode A. As I said before, level 1 had much less barrels, so I beat this one with ease, although I did lose a life to level 2. I think the hitboxes are a bit different on the springs or something, as I got caught completely off guard by one right at the end. I beat it on my next try though, and afterwards, level 3, the final level, was a total cakewalk. After that, I saw the ending and loop 1 was already beaten after only 3.5 minutes. I made it all the way to loop 4 before I finally lost my last life on level 1. I tried to run up a ladder and jump over a barrel, but I just didn't have enough time to make it. Ah, what a familiar feeling. After this, I switched to game mode B. I think since I was starting to refamiliarize myself with the game, I was able to do even better. I did get bamboozled by an aggressive barrel throw at the beginning, but I beat loop 1 easily after this, and I got all the way to level 2 in loop 4 before losing my final life. With that, Donkey Kong on the NES was complete. Up next was Donkey Kong Jr. Unlike Donkey Kong, they didn't remove a single level this time around, although they still removed most of the cutscenes again. However, similar to Donkey Kong, the game has an all-new title screen song and 4 different game modes. While the game is probably once again riddled with tons of small changes, the biggest ones I noticed was that you now tap the directional buttons on the vines to move quicker instead of holding down the button, and the game in general felt a bit easier. Once again, I started with game mode A. I crushed level 1, but I had a pretty dumb death in level 2. I bounced on the spring and barely touched the moving platform before falling down below, which caused me to take fall damage and lose a life. Hold on. Why can I jump high on the spring without taking fall damage, but falling off a platform closer to the ground makes me lose a life? Anyway, I beat it on my next try afterwards. In level 3, I wanted to test a mechanic that was in the arcade game that lets you hit sparks above you with falling fruit. Unfortunately, it didn't work in this version, and I ended up ramming my head straight into a spark. Once again though, I beat this level with my next life. Next up was level 4. Thankfully, there were so much less birds thrown at you in this version. The difference was like night and day. Because of this, I conquered this level on my first try and saw the ending. To my surprise, they changed something else here. Instead of Mario getting up and going after Donkey Kong again, he seemingly just dies and lays there with a halo over his head. I'm kinda surprised they did this, especially considering they're already starting to use the character more and more by this point. Maybe they only meant for him to appear knocked out? Anyway, with loop 1 done, I was satisfied with this mode, but I decided to see how far I could go. I made it to level 2 in loop 3 before finally losing my last life to a bird. On to game mode B. Now that I was more familiar with the changes in this version, I beat a whole loop without losing a single life. I kept going, and once again lost my remaining lives to the second level in loop 3. I lost one silly life by failing to grab onto a vine in the section above the spring, and I lost my final life to the birds once again. With that, Donkey Kong Jr. was complete. Up next was Popeye. This was the only one of these 4 that I had not played prior to the challenge. However, since I already played the arcade version before in this challenge, I roughly knew what I was getting myself into. While the stages themselves don't change this time around, there's a handful of other adjustments they made. Like the other two, the game also has a new title screen song along with 4 different modes. The graphics of this one have been notably downgraded this time around, and it is especially noticeable with how much less detailed the character sprites are. While I think the AI of Brutus seems a bit easier this time around, the big difficulty change is that they have completely removed the Sea Hag from appearing on the side and throwing bottles. I started with Game Mode A. The balancing changes to this mode made it pretty easy. I got all the way to the final level before Brutus finally took one of my lives, although I was able to beat it pretty quickly on the next try. Like the arcade version, the Sea Hag throws skulls at you after you beat Loop 1. While this does make it notably harder, I was able to beat Loop 2 as well. Interestingly, the Sea Hag is no longer there throwing skulls for level 3 on the ship. I finally lost my last life in level 1 on Loop 3. After this, I moved on to Game Mode B. In this mode, the Sea Hag starts out with the skulls right at the beginning of Loop 1. Now, you might think I beat this pretty quickly, since I was able to beat a loop with the skulls in Game Mode A, but unfortunately, I struggled a bit with this one. Those darn skulls just kept getting the better of me. Finally, on my 5th try, I was able to beat it, and I got to the last level of Loop 2 before losing my last life. With that, Popeye was complete. The final game is Mario Bros. Like I said before, this one didn't actually release until a few months after the Famicom launched, but there just wasn't a better place to put the summary of this game, so I decided to lump it in with all the other arcade remakes. Like all the other ports, there is a new title screen song along with 4 total game modes. There are quite a few changes in this one. In general, the sprites have been adjusted quite a bit to fit the new screen size, and other than Mario himself, the sprites feel a lot smaller. This is especially noticeable with the size of the fireballs, making them much easier to avoid now. In general, the game feels a lot less hectic, making the game quite a bit easier all around. Another big change is that the physics are a lot less slippery, which made it a lot easier to control. The final big change is that they removed some of the late game difficulty additions. The dark bonus stages are gone, and the icicles have been removed too. Because of these removals, the game starts to loop after only level 18. Because of these changes, I decided to make my goal beating level 18 in both game modes. Despite generally being much easier, I still struggled on my first run. I guess it was just taking me a bit to adjust to some of the changes in this version. My next one went a lot better though, and I got all the way to level 21 before losing my last life. And in Game Mode B, I made it to level 20 on my very first try. Mario Bros. Complete. On to the reviews. Whew, we got a lot to cover here, huh? Well, honestly, my thoughts on all of these ports are pretty much the same. Generally speaking, I think I like these versions of the games better than their arcade counterparts, although not by much. The biggest improvements have been to the difficulty balancing, and generally speaking, I think these versions feel more fair than their arcade counterparts. That being said, I did miss seeing the pie level in Donkey Kong. All things considered, I still gave each of these games the same score as their arcade versions. That being a 7 out of 10 for Donkey Kong, a 7 out of 10 for Donkey Kong Jr., and a 7 out of 10 for Popeye. The general balances to Mario Bros. Was almost enough to bump it up to a 7, but I ultimately decided to keep it at a 6 out of 10. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it'll help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.